seldom been at a group or presentation before where I was so tempted to throw my slides away and just wing it after everything we've had this morning. But I think the presentations we've had this morning have hit on a lot, okay? We've covered the ground. In trauma, we've come at it in about 15 different directions. So what we're going to be doing in this session is kind of wrapping up and reinforcing the things we've been talking about already. Then what we're going to do is link what we already know about trauma, because everybody in this room's had Trauma 101, I would imagine. And we're going to link it to opioid use disorders, in particular, as a type of substance use disorder. And we're going to see some surprisingly similar effects of brain chemistry and neuroanatomy that you may not know that you already know. And then the last part of what we'll discuss today is some tools to put in your tool belt to take with you, because one of the most important things that we can do is, of course, take care of ourselves, but also promote the health and well-being of the people we work with and the atmosphere in which we work. And I always hate having a big event like this without some calls to action, so we'll do that today too. All right. To give you an idea about what I do, and I don't show you this because I need the reinforcement. I have two really cute doggy cats at home, so they give me all the adoration I need. Michelle and Barack. Actually, it's Michelle and Bobo because he's more of a Bobo than a Barack. If you met him, you'd know what I meant. But what we'll do, oh, I really flew ahead here. See, I'm excited to be here. Hopefully nobody has a seizure disorder. If so, don't look at the screen. Here's what I do. Okay, I'm at St. Louis University, yes, in St. Louis, Missouri, fine Catholic Jesuit school. I'm at the tender age of 53. 2 years ago, I took the new board exam in addiction medicine. It's one of those things, it's a good thing you don't know what the future holds because you'd go running the other way. But we just got approved by the powers that be in medicine to be the first addiction medicine fellowship in Missouri. So we'll be building that out in the next year. Clinical practice, as mentioned before, I love the glamorous side of healthcare. There is a Lifetime series with my name on it coming soon. But the first in my family go to college, and I've never really understood the whole hierarchical thing. And I found my love and passion in the community. So give me a clinic with 3 expired meds before you give me a marble lobby with a water feature, and I'll be happy. And for 15 years, my job was correctional health care in St. Louis County. And this was during the time in the last few years that Michael Brown was shot, that we were, the National Guard monitored our building and 3 in Clayton because that's where the prosecuting attorney was. I wrote letters from donors at St. Louis U saying, it's okay to have protesters set up a tent city. Jail doctor here, not dangerous. But there was a lot going on, but I absolutely love the work, which I know many of this room think I am going to listen to a jail doctor for the next 90 minutes. Our program in St. Louis County, both the detention facility and the jail, was one of the finest in the country when I was there, because we saw it as a window of opportunity to help people access health care. All of you know that one of the only safety nets in this country is correctional health care, which is extremely sad. Don't tell our legislators that, they might want to change it. But it gave me an opportunity to really work with people who often did not have the opportunity to have that access. My current projects, and I mention this to you guys because I know this is a diverse group. There's people here from many different professions, many different paths in, but between all this stuff, I think everybody can sympathize with me right now because we're hitting a lot of the areas that y'all work in. Right now, 30% of my time is spent working with Assisted Recovery Center of America, which is the largest practice in Missouri, where we work with 11 agencies at over 30 sites doing telehealth around the medication piece around addiction. We'll talk about that today. I also work with our state targeted response. Do you guys have a very active state opioid response here in Maryland? And you've heard of it? Okay. You're an expansion state. I only aspire to be as such in Missouri. We're still one of those 13 states who know better, damn it. Don't tell us how to spend our money on health care. Yes, I'll get political. Be over. Just get used to it. They flew me in. It's their fault. Okay. And then finally, Alive and Well Communities is a trauma-informed community organization in St. Louis. We're in our second year as our own 501c3 criminal justice ministry on their board. I work with folks coming back from prison after 10, 20, 30 years. We help people walk back into the society. And then the Regional Health Commission. Okay. Baltimore and St. Louis. I'm a St. Louis native. I have known all my life, or at least since high school, that we're very similar to Baltimore and St. Louis. And a lot of those reasons are there. Missouri is the most northern southern state, the most southern northern state. We were historically very Catholic, names right there. We were shaped by the fact that we had access by water. We are now mostly black in St. Louis, mostly black in Baltimore. And again, I don't know, Baltimore City is not part of Baltimore County, correct? Correct. Okay. Is it because people knew back then they didn't want to take care of the dumb farmers like they did in St. Louis? Okay. Well, that's what happened in St. Louis. But perhaps most important is that our demographics are incredibly similar. Cost of living, educational attainment, crime, police tensions, lots of brick. But more importantly, I mentioned Michael Brown earlier, and I know you have Freddie Gray, and you have many, many more, which the students brought up here. We are very divided as a city. I can tell you one thing of hope that I find in St. Louis is that we have had more meaningful, difficult conversations than any other time in my life since Michael Brown died. And if you follow politics in St. Louis, I don't know if, has anybody ever lived in St. Louis? Okay. We have a very cool new prosecuting attorney, Wesley Bell, who was a Ferguson commissioner or alderman. And things are a-changing, and it's very exciting to see that happening. So, let's think a little bit about what our daily goals as health professionals are, because most of us here in the room, whether we're administration, direct client services, wherever we are, in some way we're a health professional. Our goal is to create positive change every day. Do something good. We want to do it efficiently and frugally if possible. And we also want to contribute to a positive work environment and go home with the sense of having created some kind of value that day. Everybody kind of agree with that? Sound reasonable? Okay. A good day at work is when we get shit done, okay? Let's get real, okay? I don't have many friends who are physicians here for obvious reasons. But that's a good day at work when we get done what we need to do on our to-do list. Icing on the cake is when we don't get into fights with our clients or colleagues or stakeholders, right? When we don't regret our language in a conversation or an email that we accidentally hit send too soon. Or when we go home emotionally exhausted, okay? Those are all icing on the cake pieces. So what's a bad day at work? And we could go on forever with this one, I'm sure. But I think the biggest thing is when we can't get anything done for whatever reason. As Reverend Dr. Streets pointed out, that's my favorite definition of burnout as well, when we're given a task to do, but we don't have the tools to do it. Whether that tool be time, whether it be resources, whether it be staff, whether it be emotional fortitude, that's where it comes from. And there's some days that anyone and everyone just frustrates you to no end. I will talk about my work wife in this session, because she's safely at home in St. Louis and she doesn't know I'm doing it. Kelly's an educational psychologist, and she directs all of our medical student activities in family medicine. I was joking at lunch today. Any of you guys like those Funko Pop figures? You know, the big heads and their cartoon characters, right? Well, Kelly is somewhere on the continuum every day of Mary Poppins and Maleficent. And depending on where that bead goes is what you're going to get that day. But Kelly's one of those people I can just walk into her office, or better yet, just the frame of the door, and you can tell what kind of day she's had. But that's kind of what a bad day is, I think, for most of us. The problem is that bad days can overshadow good days for a lot of what we do. What I want to do with our time today is think about what are some tools and ways to reframe working with our clients with substance use disorders, with trauma, that can help us turn down the temperature a little bit on some of our days. Why do I say that? Because of the glamorous career I've had. I mean, I would go into the jail every day and it's like, cool, I'm at the jail. And people are like, what is wrong with you? But it's because it took a long time for me to kind of do a lot of changing, shifting, reframing what the conversations I was having and what I was expecting of myself and my patients. Okay. The reason. Raise your hand if you would say your patient or client caseload are really easy to work with. I'm not seeing anyone. Okay. There's something wrong with us collectively in this room, right? We like the people who are really challenging, who have what we would say in medicine, comorbidities, right? Substance use disorder, co-occurring mental illness. Guess what? We'll talk a little bit more. When people are early in recovery, their brains aren't working right. I'm not saying that to be critical. I'm just saying it because it's the fact. Neurotransmitters are off. People's brain structure has been affected. There's a lot of things that are going on, and motivation changes with that too. And there's nothing more rewarding than working with a motivated client, right? Okay, so it's tough. It's hard to do. And I'll get this clicker done by the end of the day, okay? Here are a few assumptions I always like to start my more challenging talks with about the human condition. I don't think people are stupid. Never. I don't think people are dumb. I don't think people are evil. I think people tend to make what they think is the best choice in how they perceive the data in front of them. And then also, as I tell my students so much that they will shut me up one of these days, if our clients or patients are behaving in such a way that doesn't make sense to us, we're not asking the right question, okay? I would love to tell all the people at SLU that that's a very Catholic Jesuit way to look at things. I tell the donors that if I'm asking for money. But the bottom line is, people generally make what they think is the best decision, and if we don't understand their decisions, we're not asking the right question. President in 1980? Reagan. Who was the first lady in 1980? Nancy. What was Nancy Reagan's catchphrase? Just say no. Okay. 1980, we saw the slope like that for incarceration rates go up because of just say no, mandatory minimums, and the war on drugs. Okay, war on drugs didn't work. Mandatory minimums, what did we do? We arbitrarily made laws that hyper-incarcerated young men 8 times higher penalties for crack cocaine than the same amount as coke, right? Okay. And then the other one was just say no, war on drugs. Just say no. We'll go just say no. Didn't work. Okay. And we've got people, bless their hearts, in the Senate right now who want to bring that back. They need to read some history, or at least wiki. Okay. So, that being said, let's take a look moving forward that we have our game rules, okay, are in place. All right. Some of you are feeling like this right now. Trauma and trauma exhaustion. It's like, I have had enough trauma. I used to take care of a lady, and used to do home visits, Miss Bridget, in the Jeff Vanderloo neighborhood in near North St. Louis. I love Miss Bridget. She'd tell me how when she was a young lady, she'd dance on the tables in the clubs in East St. Louis. But one time I saw her, she was in her 80s, and I'd say, Miss Bridget, how are you doing today? She says, honey, I am Tad, T-I-D-E, Tad. And I was thinking about that when I found this slide. Because right now, we know that we have been talking about trauma for a long time, and we are ready to now do something about trauma. So let's move forward today and see what some of those practicality things we can do in taking care of ourselves. Okay, pair of aces. Who's seen this before? Okay. Our talk this morning from Kaiser Permanente, great. I think they did an excellent talk. I think, though, the Kaiser system, for I would imagine most people in this room, is an aspirational system. It is for the systems I've worked in. Most of us do not have the resources Kaiser has to do the work Kaiser does. Okay. I wish all of our patients were like those at Kaiser's. They all had jobs, they all had good insurance, as our patients like to say, but they're not there yet. And I think one of the things I love about this, and I'm glad my head didn't hit it might hit the sprinkler, we know this stuff, but we also know where our field is going, is that looking at our ACEs by themselves are not going to get us very far as a society. It helps us put on Band-Aids. It helps us keep people from falling into the river. And it's important work. I've put on a lot of Band-Aids in my life. But what we have to do is get to these adverse community environments that are in the soil, right? Okay. One of the things that is so exciting that has happened to me a few months ago is what came through was I have a secondary appointment in the St. Louis University Center for Health Law Studies in the School of Law. And people go, what the hell are you going to do in the law school? I said, look at mitigation. No. St. Louis U's Health Law Center is the #1 in the country for 15 years running. The law professors look at issues of access to care, capacity of care, disability issues, health equity, racial equity, and how that plays out in our laws and policies in the US. I think it's so exciting to be able to move to work with, and I'm not moving anywhere, but I will be working more explicitly with the law faculty to see how do we move these issues forward and start looking at issues in the soil so that we don't have as many flourishing ACEs above the soil. And that's where I think our partnerships with our community agencies are so important to help us move forward. Okay. So, trauma and opioids. I've been introducing this topic for 20 minutes now. Okay. This is what we're going to compare back and forth. The trauma stuff we've done a great job of seeing and covering already today. And we know a lot of these things I've kind of given you the summary already. We see the effects of the brain and chemistry are similar, the effects of behavior are similar, but we'll also see that interventions can be similar and they are possible. I think right now in this epidemic, the opioid epidemic looks like such a big iceberg, it gets scary sometimes on how we can address it. So let's start off first with trauma, brain structure, brain chemistry, structure and chemistry gone awry, and surviving and thriving. Dr. Lee did an excellent job today of talking like a physician. I will talk like a person. And let's think about the brain. Everybody's seen good brain pictures. We've got some coming up. Brain stem, right? The amygdala, all that good stuff down here, the hypothalamus, pituitary. Brain stem stuff, it's the stuff that controls drug, sex, and rock and roll, right? Our ability to breathe, we get hungry, it keeps us awake, we need to procreate. That's a medical term. Okay, those are the things that drive it, right? I like to call that the lizard brain, because it's also called the reptilian brain, right? The vestigial brain, the first brain that every animal kind of has. Develops first in utero. Okay, prefrontal cortex up here. Executive functioning, right? It tamps down what goes on down here. So you might want to have a margarita at 2 o'clock, but it's like, oh, my boss thinks I'm at a conference, I probably should stay. That's your executive function working and tamping down that, right? We call that the wizard brain. Lizard brain, wizard brain. Isn't that adorable? And I talk to docs like this too, so don't feel like I'm talking down to you. They usually don't invite me back, but that's okay. So, what we're going to talk about is, we know that from Dr. Lee this morning, that those get out of balance. And you would think we work together to develop these slides. But we know the effect of trauma on neurons, nerve cells. We know that in development it becomes a real problem. And she even talked about these delays that can happen, especially when children are exposed to repetitive and cumulative trauma. How old is our brain? How old are we when our brains are fully developed? Very good, 25, 26, something like that. And I know those of you with 20-year-olds are going, right. Okay. But yeah, 25, 26. Now, here's our lizard brain and wizard brain again, just so, reinforce. Lizard brain, there's a blue dot there, so it's really important. Okay? Wizard brain, prefrontal cortex. Last part of the brain to develop is what? Prefrontal cortex. Those of you who are raising teenagers know that they are not fully developed yet. That's why teenagers are impulsive, right? Why we worry about teenagers with risky use, with substances, with other behaviors, because they've got a fully developed lizard brain, but this wizard brain isn't controlling it yet. Some of us never get there, but the point is, what is exciting that we know about trauma is not only does trauma affect the cells, it affects the communication between these two centers. And the way I always talk about it is that the dopamine pathways are just jacked up when you have a lot of trauma going on all the time. And Dr. Lee talked about how that can create problems with hypervigilance. Your cortisol levels are crazy high all the time. You have problems with that. But think of this as problems with the communication between the lizard brain and the wizard brain, and it really helps, I think, us understand why people behave the way they behave. Key factors for consideration of trauma, again, keeping it simple. Age of trauma, onset, duration trauma, and severity are types of trauma, right? We've turned that into an ACEs score and everything else, but this is just kind of common sense. The earlier, more that happens to you, the variety that happens to you is going to affect things more deeply. Right. Just so I don't oversimplify things too much, are there any psychiatrists in the room? Good, okay. Simple family doctor here. Okay. These are all a bunch of other neurotransmitters, and they're important because we've heard about them. Acetylcholine, norepinephrine, serotonin, a lot of times we know these because of the names of the medications our patients are taking, right? We take a look at serotonin, it has a lot to do with depression, schizophrenia. Norepinephrine has a lot to do with arousal and depression, with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortical axis that Dr. Lee talked about today. These all play a role in that. But what I want us to focus on moving forward when we talk about opioids is dopamine. Because once we look at dopamine a little bit more, it not only helps us understand opioid use disorder better, it helps us understand the medications we use for opioid use disorder even better. Okay. So let's talk about opioids and these goodies, okay. I actually have notes up here. I seldom do, but Patricia scared me, so I knew I had to be on my game. I'm kidding. She's not scared. Well, maybe she is. Would you like to be scared? You want to be more Maleficent or Mary Poppins? Okay. So let's take a look about this with the OUD. And again, same centers. As Dr. Lee said today, whoa, the lizard brain. These are sites that have to do with production of dopamine. The communication of the pleasure centers and how we moderate those have to do with the communication of dopamine meeting the prefrontal cortex. When you mess up that communication in our brains, what happens is everything gets out of whack. And what does that out of whack look like in terms of behaviors of people we're working with? 4 primary signs and symptoms of opioid use disorder and risky use because of the dopamine pathways. Cravings, loss of control, tolerance, and continued use despite adverse consequences. Now, if those seem a little jargony, it's because those are the 4 main categories in the DSM-5, the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual that psychiatrists use to make their diagnoses. Usually, all those DSM books to me as a family doc are pretty worthless. But I really like, though, DSM-5's definitions of substance use disorder because it talks in those 4 categories. And those are all 4 categories that are behaviors or symptoms that people can describe or you can observe. We're not used to talking about cravings that much in medicine, though, so teaching my med students to ask about that is a big deal. But this is where these things show up. And notice it's very similar, again, to what we talk about with trauma. Now, you guys have all heard about neurotransmitters. They're the magical little molecules that go between the end of one nerve and the beginning of another nerve, right? They carry the electrical impulse, and dopamine is a neurotransmitter. And what that means is that dopamine affects how nerve impulses grow and change. Now, this is where I get really technical. Think of my arm as a neuron, okay? Neurons have receptors on them, right? For each of these neurotransmitters, they have certain receptors on the end of the neuron. There's something that you may have studied called upregulation. The most important ones are called mu receptors. What will happen is if I have opioids hanging around in my system, either endogenous opioids like enkephalins or endorphins, or if I take oxy or shoot up heroin or something, What happens is that the neurotransmitters connect to the receptors. Think of Lego blocks. If you haven't played with Lego blocks, you've probably stepped on a Lego block, so you know what they are. Okay. So what happens is that when a neurotransmitter or a chemical meets these receptors, if it's an opioid to a mu receptor, they plug up like a Lego, and what happens is that the impulse goes through the nerve releases dopamine. And we talked about dopamine as kind of the pleasure. I like to think of dopamine as you hold a puppy and you release dopamine, okay? A cute little golden lab puppy or something like that. I used to say you hold a baby and you release dopamine, but my male med students looked at me kind of funny, so I switched to puppies. Okay, so your receptor gets plugged up by an opioid, dopamine's released. Now here's the science part, which actually has been a huge game changer when I talk to folks. Your nerves actually change if you have a lot of opioids in your system. Imagine them floating around in the negative spaces here. If your receptors are constantly plugged up by opioids, your nerve can upregulate receptors. Let's say you go from 2, you go to 5. Why? Because there's opioids around and the nerves want to catch them. Guess what happens if you take away the opioids? You've got receptors floating in the wind that aren't happy. We call that withdrawal. Okay? Let's look at one of my favorite slides in all the world. Oh, not that one. This one. Okay. Not this one. Yeah, this one. Okay, good. I know I'm getting old because I met the guy who drew this. Okay. I always hate presenters when they name drop. Alex Wally, though, great guy, wears bow ties. Okay. Y-axis. Okay. Y-axis is opioid effect, dopamine effect, emotional well-being. Okay? White is normal, green is euphoric, red is withdrawal state. Okay? X-axis is time. So, what this shows is, why do people use opioids and what is the effect of that? Okay, opioid naive people in the room, I don't need you to raise your hands, but assuming you're not on opioids right now, unless you're like 5 to 10% of the population that just doesn't like how they make you feel, because some people just feel nauseous and gross if they take opioids, most of us, if we took opioids, would bounce back and forth over some days between, we get some pain relief, but we'd also go from a normal to a euphoric state, okay, as we take the opioids. Because what would happen is that our nerves, our receptors would be plugged up with opioids, we release dopamine, we're holding puppies, we're happy, okay? What happens though over time is that this is where that upregulation occurs. The upregulation when you start having more receptors, and if you don't have those receptors plugged up, you go into a withdrawal state. Here's where I want you guys to raise your hand. I want to know, have you ever talked to a client that you knew used that day, and you said to them, when's the last time you felt high? And they said, 5 years ago. You've had some, right? And this is why. Because when you upregulate, you continue to use to feel normal. Why? Because your nerves have changed. Isn't that wild? And we've known this. I mean, this isn't new stuff. But rich white kids in the suburbs are dying, so we talk about it now. True, but yeah. Nervous laughter, but true. Right? So, that's why it's important to understand that our nerves actually change, because as time goes on, you want more and more opioids just to feel normal. And I think that's really important, because what does this do? Once you realize that biology changes things, you're less likely to say they're poor, they're weak, they want this, they did this themselves, let those people die, right? Because that's historically what we've heard. Let's move on a little bit in time. Same slide, same axes. Whoop. Maintenance treatment for opioid dependence. Okay, same slide. We're bouncing back and forth here. This is where the magic happens, and this is where we work with our clients. Granted, not everyone needs medications to get off of opioids, but a lot of people do. We have to realize that people don't have to jump through hoops to get medication if they need it. We don't make people jump through hoops to get insulin. Nor do we tell people who are diabetic if they have a high blood sugar, do we take away their insulin and glucometer and say, well, obviously you're not serious about taking care of your diabetes. Okay? How many times have we heard that about people who obviously aren't interested in taking care of themselves because they relapsed? Okay? Notice how we have very different definitions for chronic diseases, whether you're talking about the biology of diabetes versus the biology of addiction. Okay? All of a sudden, people don't care if they don't do well with the chronic state of addiction. Okay? Okay, just to be a little provocative today to get us all thinking. All right. But what we want to do with medications is how do we help people get from here to a euthymic state again? And that's where the meds come in. What do medications do? Okay. It's about brain structure and brain chemistry. There's over 135 people are dying every day in the US from opioids, and that's conservative. I've heard it over 150 right now too. How many meds do we have in place right now to treat opioid use disorder? 3. Makes you wonder why has that been delayed so much? Whole nother topic. I'll fly back to Baltimore. But of the 3 meds we have, we're going to talk first about buprenorphine and methadone. Then we're going to talk about naltrexone or Vivitrol. Agonists, which is what we've been talking about over here, right? Okay. What happens with buprenorphine and methadone? They plug up here to the receptors just like an opioid, because buprenorphine and methadone are opioids. They're synthetic opioids, they're made in the lab. Now you might be thinking, why would you want to give somebody with an OUD another addictive substance? Because it controls the cravings and it gives the brain time to normalize again, for neurotransmitters to get under control and for the person to heal. There's a big push. Have you guys heard about a medication first model? Where people say, get the meds, therapy is optional. Okay, medication first too often is interpreted as medication only. If it were medication only, we'd have this fixed by now, right? The goal is to help people's brains calm down, neuroreceptors to normalize, so that people can engage in the life-changing behavioral therapy to improve their social determinants and to thrive, right? If meds could do that by themselves, we'd have that fixed in the United States already, because we're that good with meds, okay? But meds don't create the behavior change, and that's why that's important. Now, I'm going to draw another picture, because I can. They might take down that. They gave me an upgrade on Southwest to come here. They might reverse that if I'm using all their paper. I might fly back without a free cocktail. Okay. Here's our graph. Opioid effect. Same as our y-axis before, okay? This is dose. This is methadone. Methadone is a synthetic opioid. Can people die from methadone? Yes, people can overdose, because there's a 1-to-1 dose opioid effect relationship. See, you guys are like getting a medical education right here without $50,000 a year. Feel good. And lunch, okay. So there's a dose to effect. How do people die from methadone overdose? Right, respiratory depression, stop breathing, right? Okay. Here's the crazy thing about buprenorphine, also called Suboxone, Subutex, Subzolve, a few other things. And now generic tabs and film. Generic tabs are half the price of generic films for the fiscal people in the room. Keep that in mind, all right? This is buprenorphine. Buprenorphine, or I'll just call it bup now, has a ceiling effect for the opioid effect. What does that mean? That means that if we were taking this medication, all of us at a certain dose, usually between 16 and 24 milligrams, would get no further opioid effect even if we increase the dose. Okay? What does that mean? It means it's a safer drug because you don't get into these areas where you overdose. There's been no documented deaths from bupe overdose in the US by itself. Now put it together with benzos or alcohol or other depressants, it can happen. But this is why methadone is only available at opioid treatment programs, right? And you know how regulated those are for that reason. That's why buprenorphine, if the feds in all their wisdom decided, oh, docs can take an additional 8 hours of training to prescribe this in any setting. NPs and PAs, because they're not so bright, have to take 24 hours. We're trying to change that too. But the point is that we have to take additional training, not to prescribe oxy, but to prescribe bupe. But by being able to do this, this has made OUD treatment much more accessible because anyone who does a waiver training can prescribe this medication in any setting. Okay. Now let's talk about Vivitrol and naltrexone. We talked about our agonist therapy, right? Lego blocks, release dopamine, puppies, right? Now, what naltrexone, the depot formulation, works 21 to 28 days, shot in the arm, shot in the butt. Vivitrol. Vivitrol is really expensive still, but it works well. Think of that, that's an antagonist. It blocks up the receptors the same way, but it doesn't cause a dopamine push. It just blocks it. I could, if I were on naltrexone right now and I shot up heroin, I would not feel the effects of the heroin, okay? Because the affinity of the naltrexone is stronger at the receptor sites. It's a stronger bond, so it waits to the liver just metabolizes the heroin away, okay? You guys have all, who's seen a Narcan reversal? They're pretty, aren't they? Okay, I always tell my med students, go to the ER the next time you can see one. Because they're like, cool, it's like, no. All right. Narcan is a similar version as naltrexone. So what Narcan is an instant reversal. And if you've seen one of those, you've seen it's like going through withdrawal state in like 30 seconds, 15 seconds, thigh or up the nose or wherever Narcan goes. The Narcan knocks out the opioid and the antagonist effect takes over. Does that make sense? See how easy this is? And you pay doctors so much money to do their work. Okay. But that's what I want to talk about here, because where Narcan or naltrexone fits on this is right here. You can increase the dose, you're not going to get an opioid effect because that's not what it does, it's an antagonist. I think of methadone and bupe as treatment. Why? Get the cravings under control, let the brain heal. I think of naltrexone or Vivitrol as protection. Think of it as a vaccine. Because if you have this on board, you're protected from opioids. If you have this on board, you're treating differently because you're controlling the cravings. Now here's where I get really controversial. I do upset people with this, but that's okay. You're the right audience for this. People will say to me, how long are you supposed to be on an opioid agonist, right? How long should somebody be on methadone or bupe? Yeah, it's a good question. The official answer right now with bupe is until the patient doesn't benefit anymore. That's like, okay, everybody knows what the gold standard is, right, for treatment for addiction? Retention and treatment. If you had diabetes and you had 1.5 legs amputated, bed sores, and you made it to your doctor's appointment, would you be considered a success? No, but that's where our standard is right now for addiction treatment, retention and treatment. We need to do better than that. How do we know if someone with a substance use disorder is getting better? And don't just say they're not using. They're working. Their quality of life. We know about things like quality of life, right? Let's apply them to people in recovery. Signs of somebody's life improving. Home life, job security, food security. They have good relationships. When those things start improving, that's when I think we should start tapering down some of these agonists. Why? With not arbitrarily, not on our own, but with patient in togetherness, right? We need to get those receptors to downregulate again, right? Will everybody be able to? Maybe not. And that's some of the areas that we're really looking at now, especially with young people. If young people really assaulted their brains with a lot of different drugs at high intensity very early on, we don't know what their brain structure will look like long term yet. We're studying that now. I didn't love the picture, but I love the fact that she had it with Dr. Lee today with the severely neglected child at 3 versus a normal child at 3 and how different the brain sizes were. We have to figure out what's going on with teens, adolescents, young adults' brains. But most people, brains are very plastic, very healable organs. So we need to look at these questions when we figure out what's the long-term prognosis and what's the long-term treatment. I think it scares me to think that we want to put people on buprenorphine or methadone indefinitely. It reminds me of like Coma and some of those other movies from the 70s where people would harvest organs and such. Yes?
But isn't the Narcan more of a temporary fix, like if someone is going through?
Right. The question is Narcan a temporary fix? Yes. Narcan is to rescue people from an overdose. But naltrexone or Vivitrol, those can stay in your system for 3 to 4 months, and that protects you. So what I am kind of...
Does it block the craving?
No, but by that point, that's my next point. You gave me my intro. So what am I saying? I'm saying that for a lot of people, we should be able to move from where we're going from an agonist to an antagonist over time. If people need time for their brains to heal, if they need times for their neuroreceptors to stabilize, if somebody needs to be on a methadone because their opioid effect they need is higher than the ceiling effect, this is complicated. It took me afternoons to study on this one. But if you get it right now, you're smarter than me. These are the people who need methadone. If at the height of bupe dosing they're still getting cravings, they need a bigger agonist, and that's where methadone comes in. But in my mind, if somebody's doing well on these, their quality of life improves, their social determinants improve, we should work with them to see, are you ready to try a taper or a trial of decreasing this slowly, years slowly, not weeks slowly, to let your brain, your receptors downregulate, and then maybe it's time to go on to Vivitrol for a while. Think of the nurse who broke her ankle pushing a bed in the hospital, okay? If you guys know a med-surg floor nurse with a good back, let me know. But breaks her ankle, didn't go to PT because she had to get back to work, gets hooked on Percocet. She's 35 when this happens. She has a job, she has a husband, she's got kids, she's got structure of life in place. She would probably do well going on a Vivitrol very quickly, right? Little Bobby, who gets into mom and dad's liquor cabinet at 12, who gets marijuana at 14, gets piriform heroin on the playground at 16, has an IV habit at 18, his brain probably needs time to heal and might need to be on buprenorphine or methadone for a while to let the chemistry stabilize before he could get onto a Vivitrol. Yes?
I want to call to your attention the work being done by a Dr. Edmund Chapman in Washington, D.C., where his research has shown that those medications are, how should I say this, depending upon ethnicity, those medications may, the recommended doses may or may not be sufficient for the person that's being treated. His research is very, very interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I will give you that information for you.
Thank you. And what's so important about that is that there's only 3 meds. People, and I say people, I should say most physicians, PAs, and NPs who can prescribe this, they want to know the exact dose for each person. Guess what? It doesn't work like that. What do you have to do? Talk to your patient. I know. Isn't that primitive? But you do. You got to talk to your patient. You got to see how they're doing. That's why this is a team sport. To do addiction medicine right, it takes a village. And you should have mental health professionals, RNs, peer support specialists, so that you can have different roles in communication and different intensity of communication. And guess what? The most intense communication is not with the physician. It's probably with the peer support specialist, right? Okay. So why aren't we all addicted? Okay. Dr. Beirut is at that other little medical school in St. Louis, Washington University. They're lovely. Okay. They have a beautiful campus and lots of trees. Not as many as we do, actually, now that I think about it, because they keep tearing it down to build new buildings. But I love this slide because this gets to this issue of why aren't we all addicted? If you look at this cascade from never use to initiation, regular use, dependence, and cessation, we all have people in our life who can go out and drink on the weekends and have no problem. We have other people in our life, they have 2 drinks and woohoo, right? Or they develop a serious problem, like our Grey Goose women up here in the front row. Not going to point out. What I like about this slide, it talks about the progression, but it also talks about the fact that there are environmental factors and genetic factors related to this. Now, I don't want to disparage Dr. Beirut, but guess what? We've known since 2004 at least. The World Health Organization came out with the exact same principles, and I believe that Dr. Streets referred to this today as well. But they were looking at mental health disorders, but guess what? They're the same for substance use disorders. We have protective factors, and again, makes sense, right? Once you make the connection, or it's like we like to say, diagnoses are easy when you think of them first. Okay, so environmental factors, things like all the things we've talked about, relationship-driven things. Safe home, safe relationship, good life events, social integration, individual things, a sense of self-efficacy, internal locus of control, the ability to resist social pressure. One thing that should be added onto this is one thing that works real well with adolescents, which is asset building, right? Focusing on assets and denormalization. But we'll talk about that later. Vulnerabilities, extremely important when we look at our pair of ACEs trees, right? Because we know that these vulnerabilities are the things in the soil that we need to be aware of when we're working with young adults, etc. When the soil isn't rich, these are the vulnerabilities that are going to make someone more predisposed to a use disorder. Again, not rocket science, but when you see it all together, I think it's kind of a light bulb moment. All right. For the last part of our discussion today, let's talk about some tools to get your work done. I was laughing at lunch today with a few people, saying that one of my least favorite audiences to talk to are physicians. We're a concrete bunch, okay? And I usually tend to lower the bar a whole lot when I talk to docs about things that you should do anyway. But most physicians will have 15 million reasons not to, like, I don't have time, or it's not the EHR, or I don't get compensated based on that, you know, all that stuff. Have you heard that before? Okay. So I usually say to docs and to usually those med students who are going to be the interventional radiologists, you know, that we need so many more of in our country. Not primary care docs, but interventional radiologists. Okay. Am I tangential? You're awake. I've done my job. Okay. I often tell med students and physicians, you need to understand trauma to ask these questions to get your work done. Or as my work wife, who I mentioned earlier, Kelly, educational psychologist, she will say to the students, if your patient knows you care about them, they will be honest with you. You will get the information you need to get your work done. And then she follows up and says, so if you don't care about them, act like you do, because then you will get your work done. Okay. With docs, I often say, you need to find out and understand the impact of social determinants of health on your patient if you don't want to get dinged for readmission at 7 days. Because guess what? Most physicians still think that we can cut readmission rates by something we do in the hospital. No. How do we cut readmission rates? By understanding the environment we're sending our patient back to and whether patients have the ability to follow through on the behaviors that will keep them from coming back to the hospital. I know, we're pretty dumb as physicians. But let's take a look then at things we can do. I did shelter care for about 7 years in St. Louis, and I started when I was a med student at St. Louis U, because something just clicked for me. I was much more comfortable in the shelters than in the hospitals. And one of the things that I learned to start asking was, wow, why are you here? Why are you homeless? These are not things like I say, hi, I'm Fred Rottnek, why are you here? But these are questions I would ask once, because the shelters are like a lot of our places. We have our frequent flyers, you have the guys you develop relationships with, and in time I would say, you know, why are you here? Or, I've been told by the people who work here that usually won't come to a shelter. Why is that? And we all know those answers right now. People get rolled in shelters, they get stuff stolen, they're schizophrenic, etc. Perhaps most importantly, I learned to ask, what's most important for you right now? Okay? And why is that important? Think back to when, okay, you're 4 or 5, and you're at a family gathering, and Grandma Betty or Aunt Hilda says to you, honey, what do you want to be when you grow up? Can you all think back to there? Are you in that mind space? Okay. Now raise your hand if you said, I want to be an alcoholic. Or I want to be in prison. Or I want to be homeless. Okay. These are not aspirational states. My students are like, wow. It's like, come on, people. No one aspires to be in these life situations. We are all professing that we want to be healers. That means we need to ask questions related to how did these people get into these situations, and learn to listen to understand that. And I always call that asking the next question. And sometimes that means I have to set aside the things that I think are most important in a clinical encounter. Yes, you do want to address the things that can kill your patient right off the bat. But usually those can wait a little bit. And you guys all know that. Find out what motivates your patient. Ask that next question. And the nice thing about this is when I work with my med students and really push, they'll eventually get to a social determinant of health question or a trauma question, right? Because that's usually what has driven a lot of bad health outcomes because of quote-unquote choices people make, which usually aren't choices. Okay. So ask the next question. Okay, a day behind bars, 15 plus years, medical director, St. Louis County Jail and Juvenile Detention, loved it. For me, it was a step up. I was doing homeless work. Now I had meds that were not expired and nurses, but and x-rays. But I really loved it because I knew going into a jail setting that most of my folks were going to be people without resources. And that's my catch term. No money, no people who gave a crap about them, low health literacy, no job, etc. Goes on and on. Especially people who sit there for a while, right? So I had my rough times, all 15 years, but the first few years were a lot rougher. To give you an example about using this method of critical reflection, I teach this to all our medical students. It's actually a Jesuit teaching principle from way back in the day with Ignatius of Loyola. What, so what, now what? What happened? Why did it catch your attention? And how can I process this to learn from this and move forward? That's a what, so what, now what? I realized early on at the jail, if I had a bad morning, most often it was because I got too many calls at night from nurses with emergencies or intakes, because we were a mega urban jail with 1,300 to 1,400 people there any given day. We had 35,000 admissions go through intake every year. Okay? So big jail. And I was like the sheriff of a small town, I felt sometimes. But I loved it. But if I got a lot of calls and I was tired the next morning, I realized for some reason the people that really bothered me were the pregnant women coming in drinking 2/5 a day or a gallon a day. And I thought, after the third time this happened, I thought to myself, this does not make sense, Fred. You can work with folks who killed their families, or you name it, but for some reason, obviously pregnant women who come in drunk are upsetting to you. So my short-term fix was Todd, our PA, saying, Todd, would you see that person today? I'm not at my best. So that was my short term. My longer term was to engage in this process, to really think, why is this rubbing me the wrong way? Well, in the Rottnek family growing up, responsibility was a competitive sport. Choosing your breakfast cereal was a big decision. And also for the Rottneks, a hobby was a second job, right? So I was conflating this idea of, I was seeing this obviously pregnant woman as seeing, oh, well, her job is obviously to take care of her health and that of the fetus. And here she is drinking 2/5 to a gallon a day. And meanwhile, back at the department at SLU, they were doing studies on fetal alcohol syndrome, right? It took me a while to realize that I'm pulling forward my baggage onto this clinical situation, and I realized, okay, I need to see this from her perspective. And when so I started talking to the patients more and say, why were you drinking that much? And we all know why, because the women were usually being pimped out, sex trafficking, some issue like that, and they had to get drunk to get through their day. Made complete sense. They weren't like hanging out at the club and having their Grey Goose and being cool. That would be a commitment to get down that much vodka in one day. But it took me sitting down and talking to the patient and seeing from their perspective and seeing their trauma what was going on. Once I made that connection, I had no problem moving forward. But that's why I love this technique, and I teach it to my students. When they have clinical situations or a conversation or something that really strikes them, either good or bad, but they don't understand it, start thinking through these pieces. What happened? What in your life informs what happened? And then what can you learn from it to move forward into your professional life? So that's another tool that I give you today as an opportunity. Talk to colleagues. Sometimes we tend to surround ourselves with similar people because it's easier, right? Okay. My role model through residency way back in the day, 95 through 98, has been my best friend for the last 20 years once I finished residency, because Susan is an LCSW, and we residents used to call her the queen of boundaries, because boundaries are our friends, right? Well, Kelly, who I mentioned earlier, Maleficent, Mary Poppins, she's queen of the hard stops, okay? Because Kelly is so good at, we'll be working with students, and I'll be like, oh, but, and Kelly's like, nope. Their assignment came in at 5:05 p.m. Central Standard Time. It's not accepted. They need to do remediation. It's like, thank you, Kelly. I mention that because it's often good to have sounding boards who think differently from you, because they help keep you sane. And they help reinforce maybe the healthier instincts when you might go back to your original instincts, which aren't always the healthiest. The other thing that I love about the teamwork approach to things I do is I get to learn really cool things about what's happening on the streets of St. Louis where I don't hang out. Not always. For example, St. Louis does not have a very organized gang structure. Does Baltimore? Yes, no? Okay, I'll compare St. Louis to Chicago then. Huh? Yeah, Chicago is very organized compared to St. Louis. What does that mean in terms of what you buy off the street in terms of drugs? In Chicago, there's quality control. I am told that they even stamp or brand their baggies of dope that they sell on the street so you know what gang you got it from. Okay? St. Louis doesn't have that. So St. Louis is a wild, wild west when it comes to stuff you buy off the street. We have waves and waves every month or two of people dying from some unknown substance that came up Highway 55 from New Orleans, or came down 55 from Chicago, or came from Detroit, right? The variability is really nuts. Now, I would never know that as somebody who's doing addiction work in a practice or doing stuff on campus, but I find this out from my guy on the streets. Another good example. Why are so many young people getting HIV still, right? That's always one of those questions. You can't answer that by looking at a CDC study. You need to talk to people who are on the streets and say, what is going on and why is there such a sense of hopelessness? And we know that a lot of that, you looked at sex trafficking in the 90s in Southeast Asia, same thing happens in New York, same thing happens in other areas where young people think, I'm gonna die from something before I die of HIV. So if you work with people involved in sex trafficking, you know they get paid more if they don't use condoms, right? So these are all these reasons that I really encourage you to collect a group of people around you that you can talk to who are different than you. It helps keep you sane, and it's other people to ask questions to that people who think just like you may not know any more than you do. Okay. The fourth tool, a day at school. Has anybody heard of this book, iGen? Okay. I should get royalties from this author, Jean Twenge. She's been quoted on NPR a lot, and I'm a big NPR junkie. Anyway, this is the generation, also called Gen Z, that right now the oldest ones are 22 or 23. These are the kids who have grown up with smartphones. Okay. Incredibly useful book. If you're working with teenagers, young adults, and it's like, who are these aliens? Read this book. The data is from Monitoring Our Future, which has been a survey that's gone on for I think about 3 decades now, which monitors youth and young adults, I think like 8th grade, sophomore in high school, senior in high school, everything from faith beliefs to politics to sex to drug use, you name it. I'm not saying it's a happy book, but what it tells you is it helps you understand how they're thinking, and it's really helpful for us teaching. I use this as an example because we have to stay up in our game. I know a lot of people say, I didn't have time to read, okay? Like Dr. Street's given us his 8 books, to read, read these by next month. No, I'm teasing. But we have to set time aside to read. We have to set time aside to stay up on our game, or else we get old, we get rickety, and we can't afford to do that in this work, right? People's lives are at stake. And then finally, I started this talk on why I had to create a trauma-informed lens in my work and my life. Well, here's a life example. We're back to the holidays. We have 2 grandmothers here. Okay, if you can go there and not be triggered, raise your hand if you had an evil grandmother. Thank you. I could see you people I've worked with that those hands shot right up. Okay. Now, if you didn't have an evil grandmother, you're thinking, what the hell is he saying, evil grandmother? Grandma Hilda. Poor thing. She was angry and pissy her whole life. Controlled her 2 sons, my dad, Big Fred, and Richard, played each son's family off the other, said things like, I'd love a piece of Pendleton wool before I die. So Dad bought her a piece of Pendleton every year before she died, and she complained about the price every year. You know, those kind of grandmas. Well, the thing is that I don't know how old I was when I found out that her father, when they went from Austria to the US, back to Austria, he ran a spa in Baden-Baden, Germany. It went bankrupt. He killed himself by jumping off the building, and she saw it. Okay? Of course, I should never talk about evil Grandma Hilda now because I'm a well-adjusted physician who understands ACEs. But growing up under the shadow of Grandma Hilda spreading, depression and anger in her wake, that's not how it got translated, right? So that's my little gift to you. When I go see my dad on Sundays in his assisted retirement center, and he makes all the offensive racial gay comments I can think of, even though 2 of his 3 children are gay. I think to myself, slow down. It's like going to the dentist. It's going to stop eventually. Okay. So finishing up, balancing understanding and accountability. Am I up here saying everybody gets a break because everybody's had trauma? No. Why? We have to balance accountability and the common good with our work, right? And this is where you need those people like Mike Kelly who can say, know that person is a negative influence on students, and until that person gets help, that person should not be teaching, okay? There's a difference between understanding and allowing bad behavior to continue. That's why I always think it's challenging when people who are mental health professionals can also be supervisors. I don't get it. It's hard enough for me as a physician to be a supervisor, because I'm always like, oh, who didn't love you enough? You know, but we do need to know that. Know your role, know your boundaries, know who the hard asses are in your life who can help you when you need it, because you do have to balance those two back and forth. So, those are some tools on the tool belt. And I really wanted to, when I worked with Lynn and Patricia on this, we really wanted to come up with some ideas on what are some things you can walk away with. And you're all going to get copies of these slides. But think about what one or two of these tools might be helpful for you to just make a routine or a habit to help you turn the heat down. Because we work with people, as I said before, really challenging folks. And while we love our work, we're not always good at taking care of ourselves. We're much better taking care of our caseload than we are ourselves. So there's a few some resources here where I got my stuff from. Alive and Well Communities, we had some really good discussion about what Kaiser Permanente is doing through the RISE program. We're doing a lot throughout the state of Missouri, working with FQHCs, working with other health centers, but also working with our school districts, where we're having now, the newest one is having student ambassadors for Alive and Well, where they're coming together to comment on the culture of their school and what they can do to improve it. We have some summaries about what's going on in Missouri with different trauma-informed programs. Here are some national resources. Raise your hand if you read tips. Okay. The best underutilized resource of the federal government next to your tax return. These are getting better as they go on.